90%, I guess, from Texas into Mexico is very problematic, and we'll have to work together to see what can be done about it. I crossed the border 2 weeks ago to Nuevo Progreso, a little town on the border with Texas. Weslaco is the Texas town. And when you cross the border, every American car is stopped. The Mexican army is set up there with sandbags and all of that, and they search the cars for weapons going that way. And of course the problem with that is then traffic stalls both ways, and it's a great problem when you think about commerce. We are going to turn to Ambassador Flores Bermudez, representing Honduras in the United States, and he has been, I had the great privilege to serve in Honduras when he was the foreign minister, and we worked on very difficult problems together. Honduras was hit by Hurricane Mitch, great devastation. People, many thousands were killed, and an economy thrown into a tailspin. And Honduras and the United States, we worked very closely together with other countries to try to save lives and try to rehabilitate the people and the economy. And at that time, President Flores, Carlos Flores Facuzet, we were talking with him, and I remember I was there with President George Bush, the father, because George Bush W. was not yet president. He was governor of Texas, and we talked about help for Honduras, and George Bush the father said he, at that time, had two sons. One was governor in Florida, one was governor in Texas, and could we help with National Guard? And National Guard from, in the end, 25 states did help out. But Carlos Flores also said, the president of Honduras said that, you know, if we don't straighten out the economy in Honduras after this devastating hurricane, things will happen. And you heard about, and he used the term, the boat people, because at that time people from Haiti were flowing to the United States. We had a great problem with some illegal immigration that way, and of course there had been from Cuba as well. He said, you heard of boat people. Well, you are going to find from Honduras feet people. And they're going to walk, and they're going to walk through Mexico, and they're going to walk across the Texas border, right where you live now, Mr. President, in Houston, and they're going to make their way to Houston and beyond. And because, if you think back then, there were not that many there was a traditional Honduras immigration to the United States, but not large-scale or illegal immigration. So that's a problem which, and also opportunity, but a problem which was Mexico, the U.S. traditionally, then extended to Central America, and I can tell you it's beyond. But that's when the U.S. has good times. Depression changes everything. I think Ambassador Flores Bermudez can talk about the opportunities and the nature of the relationship and the developing of this very important economic relationship, which is the Central American Free Trade Agreement, how they work together and how they work with the United States. And then, unfortunately, he may address as well this very dire common problem, drugs and thugs. We talk where the cocaine comes ashore in Honduras and goes up through Mexico and to the United States. So there are great problems and there are opportunities. And I turn to Central America. I turn to my good friend, the Ambassador of Honduras to the United States, Roberto Flores Bermudez. Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Cragen. It's really great to be here in Hiram College and share with all of you perspectives on the relationship of the United States with our countries, Mexico, Honduras, Central America, Latin America in general, and to share a table with such distinguished guests of yours here, Ambassador Kelly, Dr. Castañeda. It's really a privilege to be here with you on this occasion. Dr. Castañeda was very eloquent on providing very key references on the major crises that are confronted today, and he pinpointed out very well the issues concerning the economic crisis, trade, energy, drugs and thugs, and immigration. And it's on this last issue that I would like to begin just by making a very general comment, because Ambassador Cragen has also focused on this, talking about what a former president of Honduras said 10 years ago, when in my country we suffered the devastation of this tremendous hurricane, about having people come to the United States by foot and not by boat. Well, today, concerning temporary workers, which was also mentioned by Dr. Castañeda, there's also a tremendous opportunity that might be at loss. And I refer to the temporary workers on the agricultural field. I was with my president, actual president, Celaya Rosales, in Fresno, California, in the Valley of San Joaquin, visiting the agricultural producers there. It's just mind-boggling coming from Honduras to sit down on a meeting table, and the people that are across the table represent 22 billion US dollars of production just in agriculture per year in that part of California. And they were complaining 30% of the fruit of whatever they put into the ground, 30% was being lost because nobody would go and help pick it. The impact for the Californian economy is just devastating. It's just incredible. And that is where Honduras was trying to do something to help California and also to help our people have this temporary scheme of people coming into the United States and then leaving towards my country once again and have this done on an annual basis. Unfortunately, we're not talking about the University of New York, but you know, it's a solution for them at some point as well. This program is called the H-2A, and this is the type of visa that is being discussed. Unfortunately, Congress has not passed the law. And back in Honduras, then the example that we're putting is that they're going to come here not on an H-2A, but on an H-2O, which is wet. In other words, crossing the river. So, and this is the nature of the need to have reasonable policies in place. A comprehensive solution to the immigration is a must. The United States has absolutely reason in trying to defend its sovereignty. It's a domestic decision that it has to take concerning flows of immigration. But at the same time, it is a shared responsibility with the countries whose nationals come to the United States as well. And it's a source of tension, like Jorge was mentioning. The new administration coming into office will do very well in alleviating these tensional points that distract the proper attention to the common challenges that Latin America and the United States, unfortunately, are sharing at this point. So I wanted to begin by making that comment, and to tell you, I would try very, very briefly and very quickly provide a general picture of our relationships. I think it's very important to home into the shared values that the United States has with many of our countries. And then I would like to talk a little bit more about the challenges that we have, then talk about Cafta and the integration process in Central America and a joint effort with Mexico on what is called the Plan Puebla-Panama, which was enacted when Jorge Castañeda was actually foreign minister in Mexico. And this would lead us to recent events on position, public policy of the United States, of the Obama administration, as have been picked up by the media in hearings and in public statements, and then try to go into what the shape of the relationship of the United States with Latin America, Central America, basically could look, how it could look. So it's a very ambitious proposition that I have, so I will go quickly through these elements. First of all, on the big picture, I think that we have to agree that Western civilization as we know it, in other words, the sharing of the principles of democracy, of representation in government, principles of liberty, the principle of rule of law. This set of principles is shared basically between the United States, the European countries, and Latin America. You do not find this set of principles shared in the same way in other parts of the world. You do not find it in Asia, you do not find it in Africa, you do not find it in the Middle East for obvious reasons. So exceptions, granted, there are exceptions, but in general terms, it is the Western Hemisphere, its northern part, its southern part, and the European countries, the ones that share these principles. And I think this is a very important point to make, so that our relationships are focused in the strengthening of these principles in future. The second element that gives gravity to the Western hemispheric relations is, of course, the geopolitical fact that we're neighbors. This geographically binds us, and it cuts across all the fields. The people, immigration, for example, as was mentioned by Dr. Castañeda, is a key factor. The economic one, of course, the trade agreements that we have. The social aspect of development. Whenever you have one of our countries with social difficulties because of its economic performance, you have an immediate impact also in the United States, and this is reflected through instability in our marketplaces, but at the same time through the immigration flow into the United States. Then we have the security, not only concerning the drugs, but also violence and the gang relationship that exists throughout our countries. And finally, the environment, an environment that we share and ever more is more global. So here we have two sets of issues that bind us, the principles and our geography. But we also have the third one, and this is the one that leads into the challenges. It's the challenges that we have. And because we have challenges on energy, on security, on the economy, that is why we have a great opportunity with the new administration coming into the United States to be able to build more on these challenges. The Obama administration has qualified, first and foremost, its major challenge in the crisis that is confronting right now, and that's on the economy. The economy, as far as we can observe, includes the energy issue. It's highly linked because of dependency, and it's also related with the environment. If you recall, President Obama, at his inauguration speech, he said, "We will harness the sun and the winds and the soil to fuel our cars and run our factories." So it's interlinked with economic productivity and with the role of the United States, a new role concerning climate change, which is very encouraging to all of us. Then the Obama administration is confronted with the Iraq situation. It has proposed a responsible withdrawal from Iraq. It has also geared into the Afghanistan situation and the situation in Gaza. And this is, of course, at this point in time, keeping the new administration of the United States very busy with these issues. Of course, then there's the domestic issues, the healthcare, public education, domestic security. This is another set of issues that are a priority for the United States. But there's one that has to be mentioned, and this is the United States international image. And where you talk, this is an issue for the prestige of the United States and for its capability of influence. Just recently, Senator Chris Dodd, at the hearing for the Secretary of State Clinton, he qualified this. He said that the United States' prestige and influence of smart power has been questioned, as well as its commitment to the rule of law. So the improvement of America's international standing will allow for an improved influence capability in the pursuit of its objectives in the international community. These are a very strong set of challenges for the new administration, and Latin America has its own. And here is where Dr. Castañeda has homed into them very precisely. So I will not deal with them. I think there's no need to linger more in that field. So let me talk now about Central America a bit, so we can have a general picture of what is going on in Central America, what our relationship with the United States have been, and what the perspectives look like. If you recall, Central America, gained independence back in 1821, and we have since then tried to come together many times. The last time that we tried was through an economic integration process. It began back in 1957 with an association agreement amongst the three northern countries, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And finally, we geared into a free trade zone that was qualified as the integration process of the 1960s. There we set up an incredible set of institutions, a Central American Bank for Economic Integration, which was, of course, the financial arm of this process. We had a Central American exchange rate system. We had an industrial regime in which the 5 Central American countries would have distributed among themselves different industries. For example, the production of tires in Costa Rica for the vehicles. And in Honduras, we would have the flat glass. And we would have a period of time in which these industries would settle and we would gain expertise and have a market within the Central American system. This was going on in a very interesting way until the relationship of cost benefits did not meet the standards of many countries. Nicaragua and Honduras complained. We were putting too much into the integration process and getting out of it too little. And then the whole scheme got blown out of proportion between a war between El Salvador and Honduras. So this was a major setback. Again, violence in Central America has been a setback for our integration process. We began again, but the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua again introduced elements that distorted the Central American integration process until 1986, when a peace process was brought into place. And in 1989, we began a new chapter in the integration of Central America, now called the System of Integration in Central America, the SICA, that persists up to today and which has advanced notably. Now, the integration process has a customs union in place among the 3 countries, again, the leaders of the integration process, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And Nicaragua is joining as well. And Costa Rica, as has been said in this table, is a very special case. Costa Rica is really the envy of Central American countries, of the others, because of its democratic processes. But it has been very aloof of the economic integration process, and we are hoping that it will engage further with us. So now we have organs of the system of integration of Central America that are headed by the presidents of the Central American process. They meet, they analyze the situation, the way the economic situation has evolved. We have social issues, we have environmental issues, workers' issues that are dealt with within the integration process of Central America. So it's not only an economic integration process, it cuts across the board. We also engage in international negotiation, and this leads me to the Cafta Agreement. Central America had initially, back in the 50s as well, enjoyed the general system of preferences of the United States, in which unilaterally the United States would have this list of products, and we would be able to sell them to the US market under special quotas, under special treatment. And this evolved into the 90s, into the Caribbean Basin Initiative, in which this list of products was enhanced, the quota system was suppressed, and no tariffs were applied to about 80% of our products. And then, back in 2005, the Central American Free Trade Agreement came into being, and this meant reciprocal obligations, providing mechanisms for conflict resolution between Central America and the United States, which generated an enormous confidence of investors to go into Central America, and this is what we were looking for. So now we have this free trade agreement. It was a struggle at Congress. We won the approval of the Cafta by a landslide of 1 vote in the US legislative. It was really painful. But finally, it has been in place. We, as Central Americans, have enjoyed economic growth for the past 4 years because of Cafta. It has not been that significant because we already had this 80% of our products coming into the United States. But the advance has been important in the sense that we have managed not to have the U.S. investment in our countries go somewhere else. China has been, for example, a competitor in this field, but we have managed to keep in Central America U.S. investment, and this is very significant for us. When we take a look at the figures, we will find that the Cafta countries, as a bloc, are the 5th trading partner of the United States. As was mentioned initially, first is Canada, second is Mexico, Venezuela is 3rd because of its oil, of course, Brazil, and then 5th, the Cafta countries, which make of Central America a very interesting interlocutor for the United States. We have had an important relationship with the United States, not only because of trade, but also on cooperation. Honduras, in the case of my country, has received extraordinary resources coming out from what is called the Millennium Challenge Corporation. There has been a set of funds that have been geared towards infrastructure development so that producers in different parts of the countries can gain access to the infrastructure transmission grid that will allow transportation of their products. Is very important. And a second element has been agricultural diversification. This again has changed the mindset of the Honduran agricultural producer. Before, you would have a plot of corn and then you would see where you would sell the corn. Now you tap into the markets in the United States, see where there's a seasonable demand, and then you have now the Honduran peasants thinking about having a crop of baby squash to sell in Seattle. I mean, this is just a change of the framework in the way people engage in the agricultural field. It's a tremendous difference. So the MCC, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, has played a key role. On the security side, Honduras has also been very close to the United States. We were one of the first 3 ports in Latin America to have a container security initiative port. This is our flagship port in the Caribbean. We were, together with one in Brazil and one in Argentina, the 3 countries of Latin America that had this arrangement. This meant scanning the containers that would leave for the U.S. ports to make sure that the content is what is manifested. And then Honduras became a mega port with a secure freight initiative, which means detection of radiation. And this is a step up because it has to do with terrorism, it has to do with any nuclear element that might be in the containers. And we're doing 100% scanning with that. We are one of 3 ports in the world together with the United Kingdom and Pakistan. So we have had a very close relationship with the United States on trade, on security. We're looking forward as well on the energy situation to engage further with the United States, with Mexico, and with Brazil on alternative production of energy as well. So we have been good friends, we are partners, and we're also allies on many of the security issues. And there, the Merida Initiative also takes place, not as much as Mexico. Mexico had by itself the initiative of engaging the United States and saying, this is our idea, we have this set of objectives that we're looking for, and then the initiative took place. In the case of Central America, we have had, on the integration side, the element of defense. We have been sharing inventories of our military stock. We have had a dialogue going on in Central America for confidence-building measures, and that has helped, as a bloc, to engage with Mexico and the United States to share information, to be able to share in training as well, and to enhance the capability of interdiction on the drugs side. So the set of circumstances of our relationships, Central America, United States, are good. I think that where we have been lacking is on the personal relationship. We would have loved to see closer relationship concerning visits, members of Congress engaging the ones with the others, the people from the administration being more present, and having more cultural exchanges from the academic field, but also on the performing arts, are the expressions that make us unique, but when we get them together, we can share, and that makes a tremendous difference on our relationship. So what has happened with the administration that just came into office is that, as mentioned by Dr. Castañeda, it was meaningful for Central America to have the president of Mexico come to the United States and meet with the president-elect. And the fact that they addressed the trade issue in the way they addressed it was very important, because the anticipation was that the United States was going to revise NAFTA and revise the Cafta Agreement. And when you talk about a revision, it does have the sense that something's wrong, that something has to be changed, and that's okay if what you're looking for is for improvement. 15 years of NAFTA warrants an examination to see if there's an improvement that can take place. But not only because you have pressures of labor unions, not only because there are some jobs that might have been affected, but you have to look at the overall picture. If you have, through the trade agreements, enhanced productivity, higher exports going from both sides to the other, that means that you might have lost jobs on some places, but you have generated much more in others. So when you take a look just at a local community, yes, you might find issues there, but if you take a look at the whole picture of the countries themselves, the economic activity has been enhanced. On energy, we are also very keen on what has been announced, both by the campaign trail of the Obama proposals, but also on the hearings that have taken place in Congress when Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was on her confirmation hearing at the Senate. The whole idea of an energy partnership for the Americas is very appealing. In the case of my country, we do not produce any hydrocarbons. We don't have any oil. We are a hydro country potentially. We have to work more on that. We have tremendous capability on biofuels, be them ethanol, be that biomass, be that biodiesel. The eolic or the wind production is also already in place in Honduras. We have investment by General Electric, for example, on windmills, modern windmills in the country. And then the photovoltaic generation is also something we're looking at, although we do understand that today the technology is still a little bit too high, but it would be meaningful in those places that are away from the normal distribution grid of energy in the country. Security, again, the Merida Initiative is key for us, and we're very pleased to see that the administration recently in office is looking at that with a high degree of interest. We share the same problems, the drugs, the passage of the narcotics, consumption, not as much of the United States, but it's present. And also the violence that this brings. If when you talk about drugs, you cannot talk about organized crime. This is a major issue, especially for a small country with level of influences going up. It's very risky and it's very, very dangerous, and we are trying to deal with this within the context of the Merida Initiative as well. And then the violence of the gangs. We know what the origins are, basically from California, but this has been also fueled by the lack of conditions in our countries to be able to provide proper opportunities for academic growth, for employment for the youth as well in our countries. So it's a problem that we share, and we're trying to do our part as well. What we have on the very close term in front of us In the case of my country, is a visit by my president to the United States. He will be here on the 18th of this month. It's very close by. We're very lucky that we have managed key visits by President Zelaya with the Secretary of Energy and Homeland Security, of course. And this goes to show that our priorities are shared with the United States on those issues as well, on security, on immigration, which would be a case with Homeland Security, but also on energy with the Department of Energy. The second important event is the Summit of the Americas, and I'm sure Ambassador Kelly will deal with this issue in detail. This is a great opportunity to bring together the presidents and the heads of state of the countries of the Western Hemisphere to deal with an agenda that began back in 1994 basically on trade, but today surely deals with other priorities, especially if we're confronting the crises that we have identified and that we are all aware of. And the third one would be a meeting of the Organization of American States that my country, Honduras, will be hosting at the end of May, beginning of June. These three opportunities, the first one very local to Honduras because of the visit of my president, but the second and the third one, very important for the whole Western Hemisphere to be able to have a proper agenda, to be able to prepare those meetings in the best way possible to enhance the relationship that we have, coming back to enhance those principles that I mentioned at the beginning that we share, to be able to engage jointly on this geography that we share, and also to be able to deal with the challenges that we face. I would leave it at that and wait for any questions later on.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And lots, we can see how things are coming together. Energy, immigration, they all come together. And thank you for that, for the big picture, the foreign minister's big picture, and then the ambassador to the U.S. looking at, okay, how do we get some deals going in energy and elsewhere? Very, very important indeed. I note that I think just a couple weeks ago, there was a major interdiction of drugs in a cooperative effort on the part of the United States, Honduras, and it was a multinational exercise, I believe, which was very successful, and we need that. I just remembered as he was talking, when he was foreign minister, we had Senator Trent Lott from Mississippi, who was the majority leader of the Senate, come down to Honduras 10 years ago, but it could be yesterday in terms of the argument. Very important, as he said, that there be this kind of relationship, and that goes through Mexico and Central America, Latin America. Mississippi cotton. Honduras then provides the cloth and turns it into shirts, and then Pennsylvania does the dyeing and the coloring. So it's jobs in the U.S., agriculture, jobs in Honduras, in industry, jobs back in Pennsylvania. There was a particular skilled, process-skilled plant there, as opposed to, said Senator Lott, Chinese cotton, Chinese cloth, Chinese shirt. The only thing you get is it's shipped to the U.S. and it's imported. So there's something to be said for that relationship here through the United States, Mexico, and Central America, and beyond. Now we turn to the host country. Thank you, Ambassador Craig Kelly and Secretary Craig Kelly. He has been most recently one of those most responsible for the entire U.S. policy toward Latin America writ large. I must say, by the way, I had the privilege of serving with him at our embassy to the Holy See, to the Vatican years ago, where we did, you should know here, foreign policy and not religion. And there too, they dealt with all the world's issues. Craig Kelly really is representative. He's that career professional at the top of his career. He's been ambassador. He's been in the top position in the Department of State. He is, I guess you could say, he's the two C's. I mean, he is change, and we all know where that word comes from. And so he represents the new policies of the United States toward Latin America, but he also represents the other C, continuity, which is very important. He was, of course, in the government, in that position and in high positions, and he was the key guy with the Secretary of State Colin Powell. So he represents that continuity of U.S. interests, which don't change simply because we have a change of administration. But policies do change, and so he can give us the unique perspective of a career person, long in the Foreign Service with great experience, and he can also tell us about the change and about the new policies to come. So it's a great privilege and honor to introduce to you our third speaker, the host country, so to speak, Ambassador and Secretary Craig Kelly.
Thank you, Jim. Dr. Castañeda and Ambassador Flores Bermudez have really laid out in excellent fashion some of the challenges and opportunities we face. And it was very appropriate that Roberto cited the Summit of the Americas coming up. The Summit of the Americas is a meeting that takes place every 3 or 4 years of the heads of state, the leaders of all the countries in the Western Hemisphere. And the next meeting is going to be in April in Trinidad and Tobago. So this means that as the Obama administration comes in, it is facing this major meeting in the hemisphere, which is, you know, focusing attention even more intensely on the hemisphere. Now, why do I say even more intensely? Because President Obama and Secretary Clinton came to office already looking very heavily at the issues in the hemisphere. And I think that the presentations we've already heard spell out why the stakes are so high for the United States in this hemisphere, in the best of senses and in negative senses as well. This is a region which is enormously important to the United States, and it's important to step back a little bit in time to understand that the issues that have been laid out this evening take place within a context which shows that the implications of all these issues are enormous for the United States. I started my career in the Foreign Service in 1985, posted to our embassy in Bogota in Colombia. At that time, you had throughout Latin America several authoritarian governments. You had insurgencies going on, bloody insurgencies in several countries. You had some countries at conflict with each other over borders. You had governments running economic policies which raised tariff barriers and which led to high inflation throughout many countries in the hemisphere. Today, despite all the problems, we have every single government except one in the hemisphere has been elected democratically, and you have a churning in societies that elected governments have given rise to what we might call a revolution in rising expectations among the populations who have seen that, all right, we now have democratically elected governments, now we want democratic societies. That is, we want governments that deliver the goods for real people in our societies in terms of social justice, in terms of access to education, health, and the other benefits that we all associate with democracy and aspirations for our children and our grandchildren. And as this realization, rise in expectations develop, many countries looked at some of the examples in their midst that had done things differently and in a very successful way. For instance, Chile, where I had the privilege of being ambassador for 3 years. Chile, in the course of its return to democracy since 1990, entered into trade arrangements with more countries than anyone else in the world, 56 to be exact. During that period, it also lowered its poverty rate to 13.7%, which is phenomenally low for the region. Many other countries, not surprisingly, took note of that success and began to look at ways to implement policies that were similar. What do I mean by that? That means opening up the economy, trying to attract foreign investment, increase economic integration, not only with the region but with the rest of the world, and at the same time, and crucially important, implement the sort of social policies that help ensure that the benefits of that opening up are spread as widely as possible in society. And as this realization began to spread, we began to find that the conversation in the region was becoming more integrated, more global, and, very important, more pragmatic, that we were talking less and less about highly heated ideological issues and more about how to implement policies that help real people. And this was leading to a de facto greater integration of the hemisphere. There was increasing trade and investment crossing borders, more and more cultural exchange, although as Roberto noted, we can always do better on that. And this was occurring not only within the hemisphere, but also between the hemisphere and the rest of the world, something that we strongly encourage. I'll never forget, Jim mentioned that I worked for Secretary Powell. I was his executive assistant when he was Secretary of State, which meant I was with him all the time, traveled with him everywhere. And I'll never forget, we were in a meeting with Jorge, and it was one of these all-day meetings that we had to discuss the range of issues between the United States and Mexico. And then after that, we got on a plane and flew to Israel. And we got there a little bit late because the meetings with Mexico had run a little bit over. And we got to a dinner that was being hosted by the Israeli foreign minister. And Colin Powell says to Silvan Shalom, the foreign minister at the time, sorry we're late, I had these all-day meetings with Mexico. And the foreign minister says, Mexico? Because he was so focused on the Middle East that he thought, what are you thinking about Mexico for? You're here to talk about, the Palestinians and Syria. And so that remark earned him about a 15-minute lecture on the importance of the U.S.-Mexico relationship. He would have been proud to hear this.
That's my friend Colin.
That's right. But his point was a very serious one, which is not just that the United States has interests all around the world, but that we all have interests all around the world. And if you look at the trade patterns of the countries in the Western Hemisphere now, they're extraordinarily diverse and heading out in all directions: Asia, Europe, the United States. This is, again, a process I want to emphasize. This is very important, and President Obama and Secretary Clinton have made this very clear as well. This is a process we favor. There was a study that came out recently about U.S. relations with Latin America, and one of the titles in the last chapter was The End of U.S. Hegemony. And I was on a panel with some of the authors of this report, and I said, well, this is not a bad thing. We've been working toward a relationship with this hemisphere which actually encourages greater globalization and a most effective possible implementation of globalization. We're not seeking an exclusive relationship. And along those lines, we have tried to focus our activity in the hemisphere in ways that help achieve that, sort of taking advantage of globalization. President Obama has made clear that he wants to double assistance to the region. That assistance was doubled in the last 8 years. He wants to double it again. That's a very important thing, and we want to use that as intelligently as we can. Obviously, with the current financial crisis, any sort of budget ambitions like this are going to be tough to meet. We'll see how that plays out, but the intention is certainly there. He and Secretary Clinton have made very clear that we want to continue to focus on this revolution of rising expectation just so that we can respond in cooperation with our friends in the hemisphere to try to address the concerns of real people. Because we mustn't forget that despite a lot of progress in the region, there are still anywhere between 180 and 200 million people who live below the poverty line, which is defined by the World Bank as $2 a day. That's a lot of people living with very few resources. That number is likely to increase with the crisis, and that in many ways is our #1 challenge in the region, and I think we can be sure that President Obama will make that a top priority in the region. When we look at flows, though, the economic engagement of the United States with the region, as both Jorge and Roberto have made very clear, this is a very complex picture and a very positive one in many ways when you talk about trade and investment. If we do in fact double our assistance to the region, it will come to somewhere around $4 billion per year. But if you look at our trade just with our two neighbors, Canada and Mexico, our trade is $2.5 billion per day. So, and then you start to expand that throughout the hemisphere, our trade investment relationship with the hemisphere as a whole approaches $1 trillion a year. So aid is obviously an important but a small part of the picture in terms of overall amounts. It means that we have to work as intelligently as we can on the trade and investment front to pursue policies that make sure that that trade investment increases, and it also helps real people. One of the things we've done to help along that regard is to take those countries with which we do have free trade agreements, and those countries, by the way, form a contiguous chain from Canada all the way down to Chile, 13 countries. and those countries together represent about 34% of the world's gross domestic product. So it's a significant chunk of the world's economy. This made us think we should be doing more together to implement these trade arrangements, integrate ourselves in a way that helps spread the benefits as widely as possible in our societies. So we've begun this initiative called the Pathways to Prosperity in the Americas, through which we meet regularly, all these countries, plus others invited as observers, Brazil, Uruguay, others, to talk about how we can better implement these agreements. We've, after all, made these very serious legal commitments to each other about our economic relations. Let's now get down to nuts and bolts and talk about how we implement these things in ways that spread benefits more widely. Education, customs, regulations, all sorts of things that actually bring these things down home to farmers and business people and real neighborhoods. My colleagues have already talked about the Merida Initiative. This is obviously critical to you can't have prosperity without security. I suspect we'll get into that more in the questions and answers, so I won't go into it at length now. But another aspect of our policy, Jim also mentioned Brazil, the increased and more intensified relationship between the United States and Brazil, in some ways parallel to the intensification of our relationship with India, is something I think which clearly is going to continue. President Obama has also made that very clear, that as part of an overall deeper integration with the hemisphere. And keep in mind as well that we have an early visit from a president from Central America. President Obama, even before he was inaugurated, met with the president of Mexico. He's making his first overseas trip next week to Canada. Already an early intense focus on our own region, which is a very, very good thing. Now, I don't say all these positive things to sound, like some Pollyannish government official. All the problems that we've talked about already tonight are real, and in a sense, the progress that has been made in the region makes the current crisis even more serious, because it shows how much we have at stake in the region, including the economic future of our own country. Is in many ways related to the fate of the entire hemisphere in both directions. It's in our interest to help achieve a more prosperous hemisphere. It's obviously in the interest of the other countries. This is something that we are in together. I use the phrase de facto greater integration of the hemisphere. It's occurring in many, many ways. Those huge trade and investment flows are one. The immigration part is another. We're working as part of our cultural exchange programs in the region. We're working very hard to make English language instruction more available in the United States. But this is not an effort to impose our language in Latin America. It's a way to greater share two of the most important languages on the world scene, which are English and Spanish. You add another major language in the hemisphere, Portuguese. You have three of the world's major languages. It's in the interest not only of young people in Latin America to learn English, but also of young people in the United States to learn Spanish and Portuguese. My son happens to go to an all-Spanish language elementary school in the Washington area. Parents are killing to get their kids into that school because they realize the importance of gaining Spanish and having two global languages, or maybe three or four. I focus on the importance of the relationship, and the positive things are going on, as I say, in part to show that there is a lot at risk and a lot at stake here with the financial crisis, with the food crisis, with the energy crisis, and so forth. And this is why President Obama has talked about the need to increase assistance, but also the need to come together in a coordinated way to address the financial crisis. And you can be sure that in Trinidad and Tobago, the conversation will be heavily focused on that crisis and how we can work better to address it so that we don't repeat the errors of the 1930s, when many countries pursued sort of beggar thy neighbor policies. That we need to do the reverse this time and come together in a more effective way. The battle against drugs and all the citizen security issues that go along with that, vitally important. The United States has admitted, both administrations, the Bush administration, the Obama administration, have admitted exactly what Jorge and Roberto have talked about. We have a huge responsibility in this. We consume a lot of the drugs. We supply a lot of the weapons. There's no defensiveness on our part. We recognize we share responsibility. We've got to be part of addressing this challenge with our friends in the region. And this is why there was such strong bipartisan support for the Merida Initiative at a time when already we were starting to feel the financial pinch. We made a long-term commitment to addressing this problem with our friends in Mexico, Central America, and also Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And finally, people often ask about, well, what about Venezuela, Bolivia, Cuba, and so forth, some of the countries which are constantly attacking the United States and that clearly share a slightly different vision, to say the least, from the one that we have been talking about economic integration and trade and poverty alleviation through closer relations within the hemisphere. It is our view that even though the press loves to focus on the negative comments of certain leaders in the region, this is not really the main story in the region. I think that the main long-term story in the region is, on the one hand, that positive movement forward based on closer integration culturally and economically, and the need for us to come together to address the crises that have been noted earlier. That, I think, is the real story. You may have noticed that we have not let ourselves be drawn into a trap of trying to answer each criticism in the United States day in and day out. We actually think that that's what some of these leaders want, and we're not doing that. We prefer to focus on a positive agenda with countries that are trying to implement policies that help real people. And I'll conclude by saying that diplomacy is not just about governments and their relations to other governments, it's about relating people to people. And that's why when Roberto talks about the need to increase this sort of cultural exchange, educational exchange, we couldn't agree more. We've actually devoted a lot more resources to this. We would love to do more in every area, whether it's language instruction, cultural exchange, scholarships. We've implemented some innovative programs to increase scholarships for students to come to the United States, but we also want to encourage more American students to go to Latin America to study, so that this is a two-way street, very important for the future of our hemisphere. With that, I'll close, and I hope we have time for some questions.
Thank you very much. By the way, I just want to say I came all the way from sunny, warm San Antonio to what I was told would be 5-degree weather and you know, ice fishermen on the lake and all of that. I came because I am so positive, so enthusiastic about this Garfield Institute for Public Leadership. I mean, they have made this possible, and I see out there a fellow trustee and a man very much responsible, Bill Recker, for making this Garfield Institute work. Kathy Luchek, and we have Professors Nosar, James, I see you guys here, and it's just a wonderful operation, which is having a real impact, I think, here in Hiram. We just today we're talking with students who are interested in the diplomatic career, in the State Department career, and we were talking to U.S. students, I think 5 going as interns to the United States Department of State. So Ambassador Kelly was telling them also about that. And in addition, there is that interest out there in some kind of public service, and I think it's just marvelous. It's what we're trying to do a bit of in Texas, and you're doing so well here. The Professor Director John Korakansky will be coming to the microphone. I know when, now it's getting dangerous in terms of a timing and discipline, and so so the professor he's going to take over, and he's going to handle the questions and answers and decide who he wants to recognize and who he wants to suppress, and so but Hiram, all I can say is bravo, kudos to you. You have a terrific thing going here, and your students are wonderful, and thank you professors as well. Thank you, Hiram.
Thanks a lot, Jim. In view of the limited time that we have in this afternoon's portion of our program, I think that it would make sense to proceed in the following way. It's true that our Garfield scholars have been preparing questions to ask of the panelists, But I think maybe those questions could be postponed for the after-dinner portion of our program, because it's quite likely that this afternoon's presentations have generated some questions among this audience, and I think it might make sense to give you all the first crack at the questions. So if I may presume to do what James said, and that is recognize you for questions, just raise your hand.
Can I just recognize, first, we have our Department of State diplomatic advisor here. Adrian, thank you for coming down from Ann Arbor, Michigan to be with the students here.
All right. Then Lindsay?
In view of Mercosur and the Meridish Initiative and Cafta, you know, obviously one of our very big concerns in the U.S. is the border wall between Mexico and the United States. And I was wondering what effect you think these long-term plans will have on this, and whether the destruction of the wall would be beneficial to both parties.
Is that question addressed to one particular panelist, or do you would you like?
Any who would like to answer?
You're talking about the wall itself?
Yes.
But we have a saying down there, there are bumper stickers that would say no al muro. So if you talk to the people from Texas, from the area, there's division, but mostly I would say they see the wall as negative because they think so much of the cross-border commerce that takes place. These are people who come and go every day and worry about that flow. Somebody else has to worry about, of course, interdiction and those things. So that's a very local Texas view.
Craig, you might, next time you speak to Secretary Powell, and if some Israeli foreign minister ever gives him a hard time again, you tell him, we have the Mexican saying, which you already said, poor Mexico, so close to God, so close to the United States, so far from God. But there's an Israeli version. Poor Israel, so close to God and so far from the United States. It's a good one.
I'll remind you. That's right.
The wall. The wall is there's a fictitious wall and there's a real wall or fence. The fictitious one is the one that Congress and the right wing talk a lot about as if it were really being built, as if it were really going to be effective, as if one day there will actually be a 2,000-mile wall across the two borders. That wall, to a large extent, does not exist and will not exist. There's sort of little pieces here and there that are being built in order to placate people who, in the Congress particularly, are very adamant about this thing. And then there is the symbolic wall, which unfortunately has become more real than the real one. The symbolic wall is the one that everyone thinks is being built. And so since it's seen as a symbol, at least in Latin America, of everything that was wrong with the Bush administration, the wall has to be torn down. Now the problem, for example, if President Obama were to go someplace and speak like Reagan, say, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall, there would be no wall to tear down, which is always a problem. You have to probably build a special one so that they can tear it down when he said tear down that wall. It is a sign of the wrong type of policies. The wall and many of the what I consider the hateful enforcement policies that the Bush administration put in place the last year or so of no-match letters, detentions, deportations, roundups, etc., were all done to placate the right wing in order to get some of the right wing to vote for immigration reform in 2007. And I thought, along with many people, including obviously people like Senator Kennedy and many others, Senator Obama, that it was worthwhile paying that price to get immigration reform done. But of course we ended up with the worst of both worlds. without immigration reform, but with the wall and with the hateful policies, which is why it would be so important, and many of us have said so. I had a piece in the New York Times about a month ago to that effect, that I hope, and many of us hope, that President Obama will, without going to Congress, just suspend these policies, whether it's the wall, whether it's the detentions, the deportations, the no-match letters, etc., on his own, while he moves forward on immigration reform at the pace which political realities will impose upon him. But it really is a symbol of what was most disliked about the Bush administration in Latin America, I think.
If I could just add just a tiny bit to what Dr. Castañeda has mentioned, which is, I totally agree with him. The situation of immigration in the United States also has a certain background. Back in the 80s, there was an immigration policy in which the U.S. administration committed to be able to engage in controlling the flow of immigration into the United States. And the agreement was that there would be an amnesty at that point. And it took place, it happened, but many of the congressmen today, what they're looking at is that, again, there is a large number of immigrants into the United States that might not have all of their papers in order. And again, part of the solution would be to provide an amnesty here. And again, there's a promise of limiting the flow of immigrants into the United States. So with this background in mind, I think that it plays very well into a political ping pong here concerning what comes first. And because of the experience in this field, many congressmen have felt that first the border should be secured, and then the other set of measures can be taken to be able to solve the problems of the people that are already here in the United States. And that, in a way, plays into what Dr. Castañeda was mentioning. The wall has a symbolic meaning. It's a measure of politics that has to do with the immigration issue as well. But of course, for Latin America, in general, to see such a display like a fence or a wall, it really doesn't help to alleviate tensions or to improve the relationships that should exist between our countries and the United States.
I would just say that border security there must be. We will cooperate. We must have U.S. authorities and Mexican authorities cooperating to make sure that there's security at the border. That's not in question. It's this other kind of thing. So security will be enhanced, and they will work on it.
Linda? Oh, I beg your pardon. All right, go ahead.
In terms of bringing up
Next.
that symbolic wall, how do some of the reformation policies come into play? I know that you had mentioned temporary work in the United States, and that seemed like to be one of the opportunity solutions. I don't know how that really would work, though. I mean, anybody could respond in any way, might kind of roundabout talk about the situation.
I mean, first of all, from the government perspective, as Dr. Castañeda noted, Senator, when President Obama was senator, he was very heavily involved in this issue. Obviously, knows a lot about it. It's very early yet. We're only in the third week of the administration, and so it's early to comment on a current policy with respect to immigration. I think it's clear from the comments here that everybody recognizes this is a problem that has to address the various facets that you're trying to, regulate flow, achieve security, and facilitate what is a very positive bilateral relationship between the United States and Mexico. We want to keep it that way. And as President Obama said many times, and many of his predecessors, we are a nation that's proud to have its doors open to the world, but every nation also has not only the responsibility but the obligation to its citizens to also control its borders. Every country in the world has the responsibility to do that. So, as I say, early in the game for us yet to talk about official position, but I think everybody recognizes what the overall parameters are in terms of flow and security.
Yeah, just two quick points. One, the security question. We all agree and that particularly after 9/11, U.S. security is an issue that involves all American friends, allies, and neighbors, not just the United States. And very soon after 9/11, we had a series of meetings with Secretary Powell and others to try and set up a security arrangement, which has worked so well in now what will be 8 years coming September, that there has not been one single even suspicion of an incident, let alone an incident. Suspicion of an incident of anyone entering the United States from Mexico, be they Mexican, Honduran, Pakistani, whatever, in 8 years with any intent to commit any type of terrorist act. It's not that nobody's been arrested, but nobody's been suspected of even trying. It has worked so well. So the border security is a fact, and it has worked well, and it will continue to work well. The issue is whether you extend a reasonable fear of terrorist attacks of people entering the United States from Mexico or Canada. They've got to come in through someplace. I mean, they can't swim here, or they can, but it's complicated. It's a long way. So they're basically going to have to fly in or come in through Canada or come in through Mexico. That's basically what you have. Well, that reasonable fear, that reasonable threat has to be addressed, but not to extend it to generalize and saying every Mexican, every Honduran, every Ecuadorian coming across the border with papers or without papers is a potential terrorist or a potential drug pusher, dealer, carrier, etc. I think that's the question that is really involved as far as security is concerned. The temporary worker program that you mentioned, it's a complicated discussion because, first of all, as Ambassador Flores was mentioned, there is and there has been a temporary worker program for Mexicans, Hondurans, etc., for many, many years. The H-2A and H-2B program. H-2A is for agriculture, H-2B is for services. In the case of Mexico, it's almost 100,000 visas a year. Between 1942 and 1964, the United States and Mexico had an immigration agreement, which was called the Bracero Agreement. A lot of people didn't like it, a lot of people did like it, it was talked about, argued about, but there was an immigration agreement between the two countries, which was a temporary worker agreement. People would come, work in the United States, 1 harvest, 2 harvests, 3 harvests, go home. Why would they go home? As I explained, because it gets cold, it's nicer to be home than if you are certain that you can come back next year. If you begin to doubt that you can come back next year, then you're not going to go home. You'll stay. And there will be a leakage over time. There will be some people who will stay. They'll get married, they'll do this, they'll do that, they'll have children, whatever, and some will stay. That's why a lot of people in the U.S. insist, correctly in my opinion, that there should be a temporary worker program with what is called a path to residence and then a path to citizenship. Some of those people will want to become residents. Well, let them become residents if they fulfill all of the requirements that the United States establishes. And once they're residents, some of them will want to become citizens. Well, let there be a path to citizenship if they comply with those requirements. This has already existed, and even today, the United States negotiates immigration with other countries. I'll ask you a question, see if you can tell me. The United States has an immigration agreement today with another government. That was negotiated in the 60s, renegotiated in the 70s and 80s, and the last time in 1994. What government is that? With who does the United States have a standing, official, full-fledged immigration agreement? I'm not going to ask Ambassador Kelly. He's going to feel a little uncomfortable when the answer comes up. With who? Huh? Cuba, of course, Cuba. Country United States don't even have diplomatic relations with, but anyway.
Yeah, I just want to add on, a question that is related, although somewhat separate from the immigration question, is just the flow across the border, separate from who has visas, who doesn't, just the traffic and the trade. I mentioned 2.5 billion a day crossing our two borders. That's something we talk a lot about with our Mexican and Canadian colleagues. The Canadians have the phrase, the thickening of the border since 9/11 because of the security requirements. In any given year, more trade crosses the Ambassador Bridge between Detroit and Windsor than our entire bilateral trade with Japan. So this is a big issue and one of huge interest to the United States, and as well as, our friends in Canada and Mexico.
It's a mess. By the way, you think I go across the border all the time, but I was just down in Matamoros, another town, 3-4 weeks ago, almost 4 hours to get back across. That doesn't work. And if you're trying to deal in commerce, that doesn't work at all. If you're concerned with the legal issue, what Dr. Castañeda was saying about the Bracero program, we had in that last year minimal illegal immigration from Mexico, and maybe it was 240,000 something in the programs. The next year, what happened is zero legal braceros because we eliminated the program, and illegal immigration soon came up to match those who had come in legal and braceros. So there's your legal answer as well. The labor flows to where it will. So we can do it. We can do another agreement working with Mexico and putting in more protection so that labor and others approve.
Dr. Pierce, Ray, excuse me. Beg your pardon. Old times.
First of all, I'd like to thank all of the panelists for coming here. I'm really honored that we would have you all as distinguished guests here, so I thank you for coming. My interest is in the 180 million people who live below the $2 a day level. And I want to ask a question about them in terms of the long-term, perhaps structural way in which particularly the countries of Mexico and Honduras and Guatemala, El Salvador will deal with the poor, since they're such a large portion of the population in those countries. And I ask this question from lots of experience there, because when I have been into some indigenous villages, I've noticed that a village that had made its living on weaving in the past and weaving of reeds, and all of their baskets not only were sold locally, but they were also sold internationally. When I went there, it was really good for the United States because they have replaced many of the baskets in the village with Rubbermaid containers, which was very good. My home is in Worcester, and I love the fact that Rubbermaid could be successful, but it certainly made a difficult way for these people who had some degree of living prior to that. Now we're getting displaced. So I'd like you to talk about how is it that structurally we can change the living arrangements for those very, very poor.
Yeah, I could just, the trade point first. I mean, the trade does involve winners and losers. The question is, does trade lead to an overall greater prosperity and greater good for more people than the reverse? And I think history has shown us that every time nations raise barriers, they impoverish themselves and their trading partners. But that doesn't mean, that we should be cavalier about the cost to individuals or individual sectors when you engage in trading relationships. I think this puts the onus on government and the private sector to do as effective a job as possible in retraining workers and education and so forth, because there are plenty of industries that have sort of disappeared all around the world, including the United States, but a lot of countries. And this does occur not just because of trade, but because of other factors of globalization. Trade's only one factor in globalization. And everybody's heart goes out to people who lose their job in any circumstance. The question is, overall, are we going to make that situation better or worse by raising barriers? I think history has shown over and over again, if we try to protect people by raising barriers as opposed to re-educating and helping them find new work, that everybody becomes poor.
Thank you, Dr. Pierce, for the question. I think it's very important. In the case of my country, I can identify two moments that play very well into the probable formula to help alleviate poverty in Honduras. One of them was Hurricane Mitch in 1998, 10 years ago. My country was totally devastated. The cost of recovery has been tremendous. It has been long, but it has meant as well that the Honduran society came together, analyzed the situation, and came up with a reconstruction plan. That's one. And Ambassador Cregan was there in Honduras at that time. The second one is the Millennium Goals set out at the United Nations at the end of the past century, millennium, and there is a plan there that has to do with education, it has to do with opportunities, it has to do with non-discrimination, particularly on the gender issues, especially in a country like Honduras, where the women in the rural areas have demonstrated much more responsibility than the men concerning administration of their household patrimony and the education of the children as well. So we have these two things. Now, structurally, what does this mean? In the case of Honduras, it means that we have to be more responsible on the distribution of wealth in the country. And this is not to stem off what would be a truly open market economy, but it would be to call, for example, on the enterprise and the private sector to put into place more social responsible programs in action. And I can put a very good example. Honduras is the #1 exporter of tilapia to the United States, the world. And there's a flagship operation in my country in which it's a Swiss investment and it's administered by Israel, but there's a lot of capital that goes there. This company dedicates 10% of its profits to benefit 75 local communities that are around it. And it has to do with health, with education for the children, with environmental protection. It does a great job. And I think that's one example in which it's not only the government and it's not only the communities, but it's also the investors, it's the productive part that has to do with improvement. Then we have a program to enhance the micro activities, the microeconomic activities in the country. This is where cottage industries come into place, where you have groups of women that are producing the tortillas that are being sold in the companies that are set up by the United States and other foreign investors. And so it does help complement this whole chain of possibilities that economic activity naturally provokes, but that needs also some guidance by the government and by the actors to be able to point in the right direction. I could put these two examples, and there's another on education, for example, as well. We do have a program in which we are enhancing the capability of children to remain in school, because we have a lot of them that, because of the necessities of the families, they go and pick up the coffee or help in other activities of that sort, so that they will remain in school and finish at least elementary school. And we have improved a lot on that sense.
There's one quick little story in the artisanry area. And this was some Americans, and my wife was involved, an Italian, working with the Lenca Indians in Honduras, Lenca women who were one time the potters to the Maya, and helping them rediscover some of that art that there had been in the 8th and 9th centuries, and then with that pottery find a market. And I think it's Women's Global Connection, I don't remember, but anyway, I remember in Washington women getting together and the Lenca women coming to Washington and finding a market. There's your free trade, finding a market for their artisanry, for their pots. So it even can work, and trade can work to help at that level too, in that micro level.
And that is one of the biggest focuses on our foreign assistance is microfinance as well.
We might have time for one more question. You, sir. I beg your pardon? I recognize this gentleman. Are you yielding to Tom? All right.
In the issue of international trade, especially when covering agricultural subsidies, how have these affected Latin American countries? Has there been any response to agricultural subsidies by Western European nations and the U.S. when it comes to exporting to Latin America?
Sure. This was the issue of agricultural subsidies was one that was one. You may recall that several years ago, many countries in the region, we had the ambition of a free trade agreement for the Americas, for the entire hemisphere, and that largely stumbled over the issue of agricultural subsidies. And one of the reasons for that was that it's very hard to reach an overall trade agreement, including the issue of agricultural subsidies, only in one region of the world. Because what happens is if you cut them in our hemisphere, particularly Brazil and the United States, and you don't do it in Europe, then you're putting ourselves at a great disadvantage. So the conclusion, the countries in the region came to the conclusion a few years ago that while the FTAA, it was called, remains a noble goal and an ambition, the issue of agricultural subsidies is going to have to be addressed in a global scenario, which means in the Doha round of world trade negotiations. And, there's been a lot of progress there. We didn't reach a resolution late last year. There was some hope that we might. But President Obama has made clear that he wants to continue in this direction. So that issue, which is hugely important for the region, and there are many countries that complain about our subsidies and others that complain about other countries' subsidies. We would love to see a way through this so that we can facilitate agricultural trade, but I think it's going to have to be on a world scale. And as I say, we're not giving up on that. Does that answer your question, or?
Good. Well, I said that would be the last question. It is now 6:30. We will adjourn for reception, and you can have a chance to speak with these gentlemen. But let me ask if we would recognize them and express our appreciation one more time for some very...
Thank you.